So, Stu, for all those like audience in Taiwan, can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I'm Stu McMillan. I'm the CEO and the short sprint coach for a group called Altus. So we essentially do two things. We still coach elite sprinters. I'm old. I've been doing that for a long time now, a few decades. But that's still really interesting to me, and I really enjoy getting up in the morning and heading to the track every day. So that's the first half of my day and the first half of my job. And the other half of our job is to educate coaches. So through Altus, we've got a fairly large digital platform where we have a lot of courses and a lot of things where coaches can educate themselves on different things in sport performance, not just sprinting, but also in strength and conditioning and sports medicine and all of the other track and field events. And then obviously speed as well in team sport. So that's the other half of my job, is to run the company and try to support the community of coaches as well as we can. And as I said, I've been doing that for a few decades now. I started my career in the early 90s, and so going on about 31 years. So it's that's about it for me.
Nice.
Got a few more years in the tank left, I think.
I I like your education. I personally did the performance, like Need for Speed, and the other one I forgot the name.
Foundation course.
Yeah, I found learn a lot from that.
Good. Yeah, the foundation course was our very first course that we put together. So that was put together by Dan Paff, our head coach, Derek Evely, who's a good friend of ours and has been for many years, and PJ Vizell, who's also a really smart track and field coach in many events, as well as a track and field historian. So I think that's a really good course. It's as I said, that was our first one. We came up with that I think in 2017. We're working on a few updates of that now. I mean, updating some of the videos and some of the content. Need for Speed is one of our most recent courses. I wrote that one because there was a lot of people asking us for guidance in how to improve the speed of their team sport athletes. And there's a lot of confusion in that world. So we put together something that I hope is helping to cut through some of the complexity and some of the confusion in that industry.
Yeah, of course. So, one thing, in the foundation course and the need for speed, you guys discuss is how the shoulder balance the hip. And I know there's some coaches probably going to discuss a little bit about like spinal engine theory. So can you like talk a little about what is spinal engine theory?
Yeah, well, I met Dan in 1994. And one of the things that I remember learning from Dan is that the hips oscillate and undulate. So they go up and down and they go back and forth. And it looks almost like a train, a steam engine, where it just goes like that. And then the shoulders do the same thing to counterbalance the movement of the pelvis. And of course, the shoulders are connected to the pelvis with the spine. So the spine doesn't maintain this rigid position. The spine also has to move, right? So all we knew back then, and the way in which I thought about it for a long time, was, okay, we need to respect the movement of the pelvis. We need to respect the counter movement of the shoulders, and we need to understand that the spine connects the two things. So there's going to be a rotational element to gait, whether you're walking, jogging, striding, sprinting, whatever. We know we rotate. And in fact, if you're up in the air and you're looking down at human beings and you're just watching them walk around the streets, you'll see all of the rotation. You'll see all of this rotation at the hip and the counter rotation at the shoulders very clearly. And a few coaches understood this, and a few coaches respected this and this torsional movement. And in fact, some coaches, including Dan, with some athletes, would teach the athletes to take advantage of this torsion and this rotation and this, this as you said before, this oscillation and undulation. which essentially, and even going back to Charlie Francis and some of what he spoke about back in the the mid to late 80s, talked about where if you've got enough oscillation at the pelvis, you can actually improve the step length by, I think in his book was 8 to 15 centimeters. So if you've got 1 centimeter of oscillation at the pelvis, for example, you get an additional 8 to 15 on the back end of the lever. Now, I don't know how the science of that, I haven't checked it out, but that's the kind of the thought process behind it, right? You need this oscillating, undulating pelvis. And a few years later, actually it wasn't a few years later, but it was a few years later for me, I became aware of Serge Grakovetsky's work, right? So Professor Grakovetsky wrote a book called The Spinal Engine, and he's published, quite a few articles on it, and it's become quite popular to talk about in a bunch of different sports, but it's something that's really helped our understanding of gait for quite a while now, right? So it's what we started with was this fairly basic understanding that, yeah, the hips oscillate and undulate, and so do the shoulders, and the spine connects them. And that was about it. It's really that basic. And then once you talk about, you look in Grakovetsky's work, and Grakovetsky talks about the triplanar movement of the spine, right? So the spine moves in 3 planes: sagittal, so it goes forward and backward; frontal, so it goes side to side; and transverse, it rotates. And recognizing these movements is crucial in understanding how athletes generate and transfer force, right? And he spoke about the spinal engine as the spine being the engine of the movement, right? The spine isn't just a structural support network. It's dynamic and integral in all movements, right? So he would say that when an athlete runs, jumps, or throws, the initial movement often starts at the spine. This movement then gets transmitted through the entire kinetic chain to the limbs, right? And that's where he talks about the legs are amplifiers of this movement. They're not the generators of the movement. The legs are powerful. They're often seen as the generators, but they're actually just amplifying the movement that's generated at the engine, the spine, right? So it's then you start thinking, okay, now we start understanding the science behind some of this. And yes, we can make a hypothesis where it's important. We understand this, we respect this. It's important for some athletes some of the time, for sure, as a very, very minimum. Then becomes the question, if we feel it is important, should we train it, and how do we train it? What are the implications to our training, right? And that's, if we really truly understand it, it can actually transform how coaches look at training sprinting, both the technical aspect of it as well as the physical aspect of it. And that's very, very early stages, right? So my friend, Dr. Angus Ross, down there in New Zealand, has been doing some great work on the research of this for now a few years. I think Dr. Ross's work has really helped many coaches, including myself, including Dan, and many others, understand how we could potentially take advantage of the spinal engine in a very practical way, to improve the performance as well as the health of the athletes who are working with. So that's kind of where we're working with now. It's still a little bit of a working hypothesis. It's important. It's important enough that we need to figure out ways in which we can train it. And now there's a little bit of educated guesswork involved in how we actually go about training. And that's what we're doing now. So that we have a lot of rotational work, a lot of strength through rotation, not just about being really mobile, right? It's being really, really strong through the long chain rotational elements, right? It's generating that power, as I said, through the spine, amplifying it through the legs. So just working in a lot of different ways. So that's where we're at now.
Cool. So if we're going to talk about like training it, is it like single leg work, or like Franz Bosch's hip lock counter? Like, is it stuff like that?
Yeah, that's not really the way I would work it. I mean, if you look at how, we look at also, if there's 2 other very complementary things that come along with an understanding and the practical use of the spinal engine. And that's understanding the fascial network and understanding tensegrity or tensional integrity. So it's thinking about movement as the interconnections and interrelatedness of all of the component parts within the system. So you think about sprinting as being a full body movement rather than a single segment movement. And the way I reduce it here in a very reductive sense, and so I can simplify it in my simple brain, is I look at the body as being three segments. You've got an upper body segment, a middle segment, and a lower segment. Now, some sports are just one segment. Some sports are two segments. Sprinting is very much, or in fact, all of track and field is very much all three segments speaking together, connected, interrelating in space and time. And it's really, really important. The best athletes are the ones who have the best connections between all of those segments. So then that speaks to how then we can design our exercises. Let's think about, going into the weight room, for example. We can do a bench press, which is a one segment exercise. And then we think about, well, how does this one segment exercise transfer over into what is a three segment task, like sprinting? Well, it doesn't really, So what can we do to design exercises in the weight room that are going to support the type of work that we do on the track? So that's much more integrated. It's much more throughout the entirety of the system. So it's not just saying that we do things on one leg. It's not just throwing out terms like Bosch and some of the terms that he comes up with. It's thinking about movement in a totally different way. It's thinking about movement as the interaction and interrelation of all of the parts that are involved in the task and trying to support that coordination between all of those parts, rather than looking at a single part within that. All right, I'm going to try and strengthen the glutes, or I'm going to try and strengthen the hamstring, or I'm going to try and strengthen hip extension, for example, right? We're looking at how does it support the entirety of the task. So that's, and we can do that through all parts of our program. You do that through the warm-up. So if you came out to the track and watched the athletes warm up, there's all sorts of different things where you can see the spinal engine in action. You can see full fascial connection in action. You can see full tensegridal work in action through the entire warm-up, and then throughout the entire main body of the program. And then we go in the weight room, and you can see it there in the weight room as well. We're trying to design exercises that support all of this. And then we put it in, and then if you saw people on the table, the athletes on the table, we're working to try to support these things. And then we send them home with their homework, right? So each of the athletes have between 10 and 30 minutes a night where they're asked to do some homework, and every single one of them has spinal engine work within that, right? So for me, there's two really important patterns or coordination patterns in sprinting. And one is the hip extension pattern. So if you can't extend your hip well, if you don't have a high quality hip extension coordination pattern, you can't sprint fast. We know that. And I think the other one that's really important is the spinal engine pattern. So we try to find ways throughout the entirety of the program, and that just doesn't mean just what we do on the track. It's every single thing to try to affect in a positive way those two patterns, the hip extension pattern and the spinal engine pattern.
Nice. I like it. So I'm going to jump out to the next topic about how you guys going to design your sprint program, like weekly layout.
Yeah, it's I mean, this you can really design it any way you want. So it's there's a way to do it, and this way that we do it, and there's very few wrong ways to design it, as long as you can justify why you're doing it and how you're doing it. So it's right now we're training. It's early in the season. It's early December. We're training 4 days a week, and 2 of those days are potentiation days, and 2 of those days are primary days. So we train Monday, and that's a potentiation day. And then we train Tuesday, and that's a primary day. And then we take Wednesday off, or in fact, that's a more of an active recovery day for the athletes where they're asked to do something by themselves away from the track, whether it's going to do some Pilates or some yoga or doing some hiking or hop on a bike and just going into the weight room and doing some stretching, whatever. But it's just a very, very low day. And then we come back and we repeat Monday, which is a potentiation day. And then we repeat Tuesday on the Friday, which is a high load primary theme day. And then I'm going to run that for a while. But in the past, I've had probably just as much success doing a traditional high-low program, right? So you'll have a high-low day, you have a low-low day, a high-low day and a low-low day, and a high-low day and a low-low day. And then if you go back to how Dan set his program up and still does to this day, Monday's a high-low day, Tuesday's a low-low day, Wednesday's a high-load, Thursday is a low-load or an off day. Friday became a potentiation day, and then Saturday was a high-load day. So that was then when I was a beginner coach and just learning these things. I kind of I'm going to run this sort of weekly micro setup that Dan does, and I did that for a few years. And what I found over the course of time was many of the athletes that I was working with, and they were primarily bobsledders and sprinters, would come in on a Monday, and Monday being a really high-low day, an important day, and the day after a day off, I found that many of them had difficulty truly getting the nervous system rolling early on in that session. So what I did is I changed that initial Monday, that first day of the week, to a potentiation day. Basically come in, potentiate the nervous system, prepare the muscular system for whatever is to come for the remainder of the week. So that became my potentiation day. And then I went high-low for the rest of the week. So high Tuesday, low Wednesday, high Thursday, low Friday, and high Saturday, and day off on Sunday. But my point is, I don't think it's that important how you set up the week, because everybody's got slightly different context. Everybody has a slightly different competitive season. Everybody has athletes who have slightly different schedules, whether you're in high school or college or professional or whatever the sports you are doing. You have to design a way of training that fits both your schedule, the athlete's schedule, the context that surrounds all of that stuff, right? And I think as long as you're living by, some smart training heuristics, I think many ways can work. I think and those heuristics are, we have to do high quality work. We do high quality work as often as what the body and the athlete can positively adapt to and continue improving from. We need some sort of work capacity work to build a general fitness that will allow the athlete to do more specific work and recover from that specific work. And then we just, we design all the other stuff around that. It's really that simple. I think many ways, there's many ways that you can skin a cat. If you look at, the top 100 male and female sprinters of all time, there's all sorts of different training programs and different theories and methodologies that they've come out of. Many have been a high intensity, high volume program. Others have been a high intensity, low volume. Some have been a low intensity, high volume. Some have been training only 3 days a week and 4 days a week. Others have trained 5 and 6 days a week. It's all about trying to fit your context for what with the athletes that you work with in that time, while still, as I said, keeping to those primary heuristics.
Nice. So, your current program is like a Monday potentiate day and Tuesday high load, and Thursday potentiate, Friday high load. When it comes to like outdoor season, is it gonna change?
Yeah, it's outdoor season is 5 months away. 5 months away. So I don't know. It's all I can do. So I've changed it up a little bit this year, and part of the reason behind that is it's an Olympic year, and that may sound a little bit counterintuitive that I've made some changes on Olympic year. But here's what we do know. If we continue to train the athletes that we train, that have been in our program for the last few years, in the same way as we've been training them over the last few years, we're going to get fairly predictable results. right? We kind of know how they're going to do. Now, if that's good enough, then great, continue training them that way. If it's not good enough, then we've got to make some changes, and there's no better time to do it than the Olympic year. Now, I've got a group now. Now, I would say, for example, if I had an athlete in my group who's a potential medalist at the Olympic Games, based upon what they've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years, then I'm probably not changing their training up too much, am I? But if they're, if the best that I can hope for with training the way that they are currently have been trained is that the athlete can just currently continue doing what they're doing. If that's not good enough, or if that's not what we want, or if that's not what the athlete wants, maybe it's a medalist, or maybe it's a finalist, maybe they make the Olympic Games, but it's all very predictable. So for this year, I've done things a little bit differently with most of the athletes, because I'm hoping for, can we get a slightly different result here? So whereas, last year I was Monday potentiation, Tuesday high load, Wednesday active recovery, Thursday sort of moderate to high load, Friday active recovery, Saturday high load, Sunday off. This year's very different. And I found that, talking to a lot of different people, in fact, a lot of different sports as well, that having 2 days off in a row in a week was really important for many of the athletes. Not only the physical recovery they're getting from that, but the mental recovery and being away. There's a big difference between having 1 day off and having an entire weekend off, or an entire 2 days in a row off. You just come back much more recovered, I find, emotionally and physically. And where in the past I've basically run 2 days loading, 2 weeks loading, 1 week unloading. This year, because we're only training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, 2 days off, there's no unloading periods. So we can just continue building. So it allows me then to just do a better job of tracking some of these important metrics, because now, rather than looking at this bigger load, more of these kurtotic loads where you're kind of guessing what the adaptation will be in 4 days, 7 days, or 10 days. Now you have these much smaller hormetic loads, right? You just micro loads every single day. Like every day, almost every single day now, we're doing almost all things. So we can see how the body's adapting to it over the course of time. So I know this is a long-winded answer. My thought process initially was to do such training, this 4-day-a-week training, up until Christmas, and then go back to a more traditional loading scheme.
Nice.
But I'm thinking right now that, I'm really enjoying the way it's going. I think training is trending really well. I'm enjoying having a better understanding of the adaptation of all of the individual athletes, because the daily load isn't as high. And we can just sort of track everything a little bit more accurately, I think. So yeah, it's Monday, we come in, we do acceleration work and zone 1 work. So it's mostly concentric based. It's not super hard. It's a fairly quick 3-hour in and out. Tuesday is an upright day and zone 3. So it's a maximum strength day plus some upright sprinting and some elastic strength. As I said, Wednesday's a recovery, and we just sort of do those 2 days over and over again, and we do a little bit of work capacity at the end of every day. So we'll see how it goes. You can ask me again in 7 months, and if it's a complete disaster, I'll know.
Man, I like it. So, just to summarize, Monday you put acceleration on potential, and Tuesday you put max velocity, upright running, right?
Yes, correct.
So, is the total volume like per session under like 300 or 200 meters? So you can do like 2 accelerations there, 2 max velocity session in a week?
So the acceleration stuff, typically acceleration work in the main unit of the session will be 9 to 12 times 20 to 30 meters. But leading up to that, we've done between 12 and 21 accelerations through the warm-up. So each day we're doing between 25 and 40 pretty hard accelerations on acceleration days. So we do quite a bit of acceleration work. So you can do the math there. If you're doing 30 and it's times 20 meters, so we've got about 600 meters worth of acceleration work twice a week. And then on our upright days, right now we've got 6 by 60. And in between each run, we've just got a little wicket run of about 35 meters. So that's 360 meters of high quality work plus some technical potentiating work in between those runs. So, do the math there. It's, somewhere between sort of 500 and 800 meters of upright, high quality sprint work twice a week. And then each day we're doing somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 meters of, pretty low velocity, extensive tempo work, somewhere in the 65 to 75% range of their maximum sprint speed, just at the end of the session. That's just a quick work capacity finish.
Nice. So I want to dive a little bit deeper about like 100-meter sprinters. I know some coaches would divide into like block start, acceleration, max velocity, and like speed endurance phases. I know Lawrence Seagrave divided 100-meter into like 6 phases. How do you divide, or how do you like categorize 100-meter sprinters in like different phases?
Yeah, I think it's useful for coaches to understand that there are different things to work on through the race. I don't know if it's that useful to communicate much of this with athletes, because I think what we're talking about, by the minute or the second that you leave the blocks to the point in time where you get totally upright, which is somewhere between 15 meters and 35 meters, every single step is different than the one that preceded it and the one that succeeds it. So I feel it's sometimes a little bit dangerous. And this is what we often do, right? We choose these static cues to speak to what is a really dynamic movement. So, for example, if you're a coach that thinks about the acceleration phase as being a drive phase, then the cues are around this one phase. And you forget that this is a very dynamic thing. And there isn't really a phase to this, right? Every step is different until you're totally upright. And when you do get totally upright, you can make the argument then that what you're trying to do at that point is just repeat that same exact thing over and over again until the race is done. And that's fine. We can talk about that in a minute. But up until that point, I don't really think it's that useful for us to communicate phases. Now, that said, there's things that are important, right? So early acceleration. I define early acceleration as the time where ground contact time exceeds flight time. So you're on the ground for longer than you're in the air. And for some sprinters, that's 6 steps. And for others who maybe better pushers or longer pushers, that can be up to about 12 or 13 or even 14 steps. So somewhere between the 6th step and let's say the 10th step, because most of them are in the 6th to 10th step. By the 10th step, flight time is now exceeding ground contact time. So you can think about that early acceleration and the things that are required for most sprinters within that early acceleration as being pretty similar. All right, you've got to be able to generate high forces. You've got to be really, really stiff on the ground and not crash out. And you need to be really strong and really powerful. And, you have to keep your center mass over in front of yourself and so on and so forth. But even through that, every step changes. Every step is different from the one that preceded it, and every step is different from the one that succeeded. So there's still an element to that where we need to be a little bit more creative with our cueing systems and ask athletes to climb out of it. It's not to stay low. That's what I have a real problem with, these stay low and drive cues, right? Because as I said, the steps change over the course of time. But there is some commonality between the early acceleration steps. It's about what you do on the ground. And then the late acceleration is when from that time where flight time exceeds contact time to the point where the athlete is totally upright. And then the cueing system that kind of dominates that is different, right? And a lot of athletes get really, or they really struggle through this system. And I think a lot of that is because they're continuing to do the same thing that they were doing in early acceleration, which is all ground-based. They're thinking about pushing, driving. But now it's more about what's going on in the air is more important than what's going on the ground. So for me, it's now pull the thighs through, be big, get in front, get your thighs in front of you, start to bounce, start to climb, like climbing upstairs, climbing up a mountain, taking off from a runway or whatever. It's much more important what's going on in the air than what's going on the ground here. So the cueing has to reflect that. And I think that it's a lot of coaches, a lot of athletes I find sort of put acceleration as one big static thing where it's not. It has to change. And then when you're upright, it's, you know, the goal here of the task is to just bounce vertically as long as you possibly can. Just push straight down or pull straight up or both, or however you're cueing to do things. And yeah, you can say there's a speed, maximum speed phase, a speed maintenance phase, a speed endurance phase, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing for me, because you're trying to do at that point the same thing until the race finishes. So that's the way that I kind of set it up. There's block clearance. That's the first step. This is step 0. There's early acceleration. That's up to the point where flight time exceeds ground contact time. There's late acceleration, which is the time when that crossover happens, which is somewhere usually for most athletes between step 6 and step 10, which is somewhere between sort of 7 and 8 meters up to about 18 to 20 meters. And then there from that point is late acceleration to the point when the athlete is totally upright. And then the rest of the race is from there on.
Nice. Also, I know you guys discussed a little bit about toe drags. So can you tell us like your thoughts on like toe drags?
Well, I mean, the toe drag started in the mid-O's, 2005, 2006-ish. You know, it's as a kind of an overcorrection instruction for a few of the Jamaican sprinters who they thought, or the coaches that were working with them thought, that they were a little bit excessively cyclical or excessively backside in their early acceleration mechanics. So in order to try to get past this, they dragged, you know, the thought was, let me drag my toe as low as I can to the ground, pull it through, and that way the foot's always closer to the ground, you know, because the thought process being, if the foot's in the air, I'm not applying force. Fair enough. There's some problems within that, but let's just say for argument's sake that that's completely true. I can just get back on the ground closer, and I can get, you know, more front side a little bit earlier, and I'm not wasting time in the air, so on and so forth. And as I said, in early acceleration, it's all about what you do on the ground. It is really important. You have to be on the ground to be able to push, for sure. So that became the thing, right? So these guys were, using this as an overcorrection tool, and then they were dragging, and dragging wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to recover really low, just to have a low heel recovery. But to do that, they ended up dragging for 2, 3, 4, 5 steps sometimes, right? And then obviously the Jamaicans started doing really, really well. It was Frater, I think, who was the first to actually drag his toes. But it was Asafa who really popularized it. You know, Asafa started dragging, and then everyone else, you know, and Asafa was doing so great, everybody started copying Asafa. Okay, this seems to be the way to run fast now. Just drag your toes. But it was more let's just keep low heel recovery, and if we keep really low heel recovery, the toe's going to drag a little bit as a consequence of that. And that became the thing for a long, long time, right? And I understand it. I do understand it to some degree. For some people, I think that's really important. I think a low heel recovery is an important piece for people who require a little bit longer time to generate force, who aren't as cyclical, aren't as bouncy, you know, but you do have many athletes who need more time in the air to be able to reposition their limbs, to get the foot in the right place, to be able to apply forces. You know, some people don't need that. Others really, truly do. Like Bolt, right? Bolt tried to drag his toes and it did not go well. Can you imagine Carl Lewis dragging his toes? That wouldn't go well. Donovan Bailey dragging his toes. That wouldn't go well. Linford Christie. All of these things, that's not the way that these guys ran. And they still ran really, really fast. Even Maurice Green, one of the best starters of all time, didn't drag his toes. So it just became this more of a thing that was a confusion over, if you drag your toes, that is a fast start. Where there's and it's also and this is a bit more of a philosophical thing, but how do you actually define what a good start is? And many coaches and many athletes will confuse a good start with a fast start, and they aren't necessarily the same thing. Like a good start, if you ask some of the better coaches, if you ask Coach Tom Tellez, ask Dan Paff, you ask many of the coaches like that, a good start will be the one that sets the athlete up to maximize the most important part of the race, which happens further down the track. The fastest, and this has happened now, I think, 25 times out of 26. If you look at the 26 World Championship or Olympic finals since 1983, the fastest, or the person who's won the race, has been the fastest between 60 and 90 in every single instance except for one. Every single one. So it's not the fastest 230. It's not even the fastest 260. It's the fastest person between 60 meters and 90 meters. So if you start with that as your operating heuristic, what can I do to maximize my speed between 60 and 90? This changes how you look at the start. It's not how fast do I get to 30. It's how well do I get to 30 so I can maximize on my maximum speed a little bit later in the race, because I know that maximum velocity is the most important thing. So that's just a little bit of a different philosophical understanding of how you define what a good start is. And it's not necessarily a fast one. Obviously you want a fast one and one that maximizes your 60 to 90 meter time, but that's not always the same thing, is it? As we see from Christian Coleman and on the other end of the spectrum, a guy like Usain Bolt, right? So it's and the other is, if you've got different athletes who are much more cyclical with their most natural stride mechanics, forcing them to run in a different way that is unnatural to them will always be slower. Always. An athlete will always be faster when the technique that they're running with most naturally aligns, or most aligns with what their most natural strategy is. So part of our job as coaches is to better understand what their most natural, most efficient strategy is, and then coach them that way. And for some, it might be a really low recovery acceleration in the early acceleration part. And that's fine. If that's what it is, that's what it is. But for others, it's not. For others, it's going to be much more air-based. It's going to be much more cyclical, as I said.
I like it. I like it. That's all for like sprinting. I know like you utilize a lot of like 1080. I just got to like see the new version of 1080 this morning and try a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about how you implement the 1080 in your sprint group?
Yeah, I think at its very basic, most basic, the 1080 allows you to really dial in specifically the amount of resistance that you use with each individual, very specifically. Where in the past, when we're using sleds or using whatever, you're really just guessing, and you're just watching and guessing and say, okay, that doesn't look right. So let's try something heavier or try something lighter. So it's from that perspective, the 1080 has been a game changer just from that. But as we know, it's significantly more powerful than that. It allows us, the data that this provides us really allows us to then go a little bit deeper, that next level down, where we're starting to understand the force that they're providing, not just the velocities of they're providing, the maximum, the peak force, the peak power, all of these different metrics that it is now also providing for us. allows us to better understand each individual athlete's acceleration profile, right? And that's something that 1080 has provided for us that was really, really challenging for your typical coach to be able to do prior to that. And then once we know that, now we can better understand what type of load is most appropriate for each individual based upon what their profile is. If, you know, some sprinters will do really well and build a better, faster acceleration if you really load them up, like very, very high load, where others is the exact opposite of that. Whereas in the past, we kind of guess, everybody's doing about the same load. Well, that looks too heavy, so we'll lighten it. And I mean, that's kind of the way a lot of sprint coaches and coaches have worked. And because of this, and we're forced to pay attention. So there's an argument that maybe we've learned a little bit more that way, and now we're a little bit overly reliant on the tech and the data. And there's probably some truth to that. But it does, if used correctly, allow us to be a little bit more accurate with our prescription. And then the second is there's been not really a useful way of doing assisted or overspeed work until the 1080 came out. And now we can do it safely. You can dial it in. I can choose to do some assisted work where I pull somebody with an additional 3 kilos of load up to a maximum of 11 meters a second, and it won't take them any faster than that. It won't pull them any harder than that, for example. Or I can say, okay, this athlete has a maximum velocity of 11 meters a second, and I'm going to pull them with 4 kilos of load up to a maximum of 11.2 meters per second. So I can dial it in that accurately. Where in the past, we're just guessing. And I've never done assisted work or overspeed work prior to having a 1080 because it just, it was just not safe enough. It really wasn't. So that's, we tend to use the 1080 twice a week for acceleration work. And also we can use it as an enhancer of what, in my mind, is probably the most challenging and difficult thing for coaches to teach. And it's probably the most important thing is the interaction with the ground, with the foot interacting with the ground of each individual athlete is the most important thing. It's a timing issue, right? It's where a lot of athletes have very, very excellent, very good natural timing. With they just the interaction with the ground is just very, very crisp. Where others, it's almost late, so they don't really hit the ground and then, oh, there it is, there's the ground, and now I can push. Others, it's really early and they end up just slamming into the ground. The best athletes are the ones that have that timing the best. And that's a very, very hard thing to coach. It's one of those things you've either got or you don't. And then we try, if the athletes that don't, we try to come up with ways in which we can talk about its importance. Maybe we come up with some drills or some tasks or whatever that can better coach it. And what I found is we can do, a little fast leg drills or dribbles or whatever, or different exercises with a little bit of load from the 1080. It slows it down just a little bit, just enough where the athlete can better feel the ground and maybe, possibly, and again, this is a little bit of an educated guess, work on what is a very, very difficult skill to work with, which is that foot to ground interaction and contact. So those are the kind of the three ways in which we're working with the 1080.
Would you use it like for potentially the acceleration all year long?
Yeah. Well, we use it all year long. Right now, for example, on a Monday and Thursday session, we after we finish the warm up, we do a weight room session, like a quick potentiating weight room session. We then come back to the track and we do 3 15-meter pretty heavy 1080 runs. And then we run 3 sets of 3 accelerations. We have the first acceleration of each set is quite heavy. The middle one is quite light. And the last one of the set is unweighted. And then we'll repeat that another twice. So of the 12 runs that we're doing on each day right now, 12, all out runs, the first 3 are heavy resisted. The first one of each set is heavy resisted. The middle one of each set is moderately resisted. And the last one, only the last one to be set is unresisted.
Cool. So earlier when we talk about like acceleration, you said some athletes gonna push a little bit more, some athletes they're gonna spend time on the air a little bit more. Is that associated with and I heard the podcast you did with Rob Pacey, you talk about like pusher versus puller. Is that the same thing? And how did you like observe that?
Yeah, it's similar to that. So when I first started coaching, I was more of a strength and conditioning coach, and I was coaching up in the Canadian Sports Center in Calgary. This would have been in the mid '90s, early to mid '90s. And one of the coaches there at the time, his name was Charles Poliquin, who's no longer with us, was working on, this way of categorizing athletes as either posterior chain dominant or anterior chain dominant. And if he understood that an athlete was posterior chain dominant, then that understanding or that information could help influence what he does for his program. So if somebody is a posterior chain dominant athlete, that means that they use primarily their posterior chain to solve whatever sporting problem that they come upon is. So I thought, yeah, this is pretty interesting. And, there's myself and a few others like Matt Jordan were there at the time. And we thought this is a good way to essentially reduce the number of decisions that we had to make. Because if you don't do any sort of profiling, everything's on the table. You have to do some sort of profiling. So this was a very basic, very early way to understand, whether you're anterior chain or posterior chain. And that became over the course of time, whether you were a pusher, so more anterior chain biased, or whether you're a puller, whether you're more posterior chain biased. Now, sprinters are mostly posterior chain biased, right? Or if you've got a really, really good starter, maybe they're more anterior chain biased. If you got somebody who's a very, very good, strong, muscular accelerator, primarily they're going to be a pusher. They require the ground. They can push the ground. They're great at pushing things. Whereas, as a more elastic and more bouncy sprinter, they're more pullers, right? So this is a way in which I, early on thought about how I could profile the athletes I was working with. And then from there, I changed it to be more of a quadrant. You're either pulling on two legs or pulling on one leg. You're pushing on one leg and pushing on two legs. So then it becomes, okay, do you prefer to be on two legs and pulling things, or two legs and pushing things, or the opposite of those two things? So that now gave us, 4 different types or 4 different categories of athlete that can help me then as a coach better understand the type of work that these athletes would move towards within their training. And it was more of a strength and conditioning thing, as well as what is their kind of typical running strategy. And that became, over the course of time, even more than that. Like, this is now what I would expect to see, but it would bias and influence everything that I did towards, even up to how I would cue them, for example, right? So if you have a posterior chain or a pulling dominant athlete, generally you're looking at cues that are more about bouncing, or cues that relate more to what the limbs are doing in the air rather than what the feet are doing on the ground, which is, that's the type of cue you'd be using if you've got somebody who's a really good pusher. So they typically work really well with, push, you push the ground away, push the track back, push the field back, whatever that is. It's that they have a better connection with a foot on ground rather than their limb in space, which would be a puller. So that's just kind of the way that I looked at building that over time. We did some research on that with my sprint group in London in 2011 and 12, and then there's a group in Switzerland and France called Volodolan Group, led by Jindre and Luciana, and they had a paper that came out in 2015 looking at different general strategies of runners. Essentially, it was the same thing. They broke it down into 2 different strategies: aerial and terrestrial. The aerials are the ones who are in the air a little bit longer. and the terrestrials are the ones who are on the ground a little bit longer. So that basically was the pushers. It's more terrestrial, and the aerial is more of the pullers, the ones who are a little bit, more aerial, or the ones who are a little bit more in the air, right? So it's, and since then, by the way, so the Voldolen group of now, since that 2015 paper, have published another 20 papers, sort of looking to validate this categorization and this thought process. And this became as well the thought process of a friend of mine, Dr. James Wild, became the way in which he built out his PhD studies. So he's built out this quadrant system, right? Where do you prefer the air or the ground? Do you prefer frequency or length? And now that builds 4 quadrants out of there. We can start separating athletes into their typical general motor patterns, right? And that information can really help inform not only what we expect to see from them and how they run, but also the type of work that we would do with them, as well as the type of injuries that we may even see with those types of athletes. Like if you've got an athlete, for example, who's in the air for a long time and he's off the ground really, really quickly, well, what type of injuries are we going to see with that type of athlete? So there's a correlation between now that motor strategy or their motor preference and the type of injuries that we may have to, let's look out for, depending on what that strategy is.
Cool. So I like that concept. I think that's like, I'm going to dive into that. And if next time, if I ask you on a podcast, we're going to discuss a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
so,
it's really interesting. So the Voldolen group was, well, I mean, Deb Sides did her PhD with my group, as I said, in London. And she started looking at it a little bit. And then the Voldolen group, Gindre and Luciana, and started in 2015. They've actually come up with some really, really cool research. Like it's very, very interesting. And there's a Dutch group as well that have been working on it. And then I think, what James Wild has done over the course now of the last, I think he first published in 2021 on this. So over the course of the last 3 years, he's just, I don't know many sprint coaches that are really diving into this research. It's mostly being looked at right now by coaches who are working in team sport, but it's so important for sprint coaches to understand. Just look at the Gindre Luciana work, look at the James Wild work, and it will change everything about how you coach.
Love it. Last thing, okay. I know authors also talk a little bit about the art of coaching and the science of coaching. And personally, I came from Taiwan to the state, where in Taiwan we don't have like access to force plate. We don't really have access to 1080 with all sorts of technology. But now in the state, there's like all sorts of like technology. It's basically overwhelming. But what I found is like sometimes when coaches have like too much technology, they just dive into the number too much, and maybe sometimes they lost the big picture. They don't look at the movement. They don't look at how the athlete is moving. So what are your thoughts on like do you think like too much technology is dampening the coach's ability to coaches grow?
Yeah, in a word, yes. Obviously, there's been some incredible benefits from technology and our understanding of it, and how it's impacted our understanding of human health and performance, for sure, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that every coach on the planet needs to use all of that technology in their daily practice. I don't think most coaches are ready for it yet. So this is the problem for me, is maybe confusing what coaching is with what sports science is. And I understand that many of the best coaches want to be scientific coaches, and that's really important. But being a scientific coach doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just applying all of these different technologies in my work. It's just being scientific and understanding the process of what that means. It's trying to understand what matters. It's measuring what matters in a really accurate and valid way, and then trying to change what matters based upon what we see. And some of that is objective, and we can measure that objectively. You know, when we're on the track as a sprint coach, I can accurately and validly measure a sprint through a stopwatch, or different other things that I can do to measure this time. So track coaches have been coaching scientifically for a long time. We know that a 60-meter time, for example, is important. So I'm going to measure that. And I'm going to try and change that with my coaching. That's coaching scientifically. Coaching scientifically doesn't mean that I'm just going to put force plates in there and all these other different technologies, and I'll have GPS, and I'll have this and that and this and that, and all of a sudden you've now got, as you said, 10 or 12 different technologies, and all of the data that it's all spitting out, and it's just making this already very complex system more complex, to the point where you can no longer understand it. So that's for me, you know, if I could just wave a magic wand and I say all coaches need to do this is how I would say it. In the first 5 years of your coaching, you don't get to use any tech. You just have to coach. You have to develop your eye. You have to develop your communication skills. You have to learn. You have to develop your leadership skills. You have to learn how to do this and that and this and that without any tech. And then you can choose one piece of technology for your 5th year, and then one more for your 6th year, and then one more for your 7th year, and then your 8th year you've got to throw one of those out, and 9th year maybe you got to pick one up again. And then that's how it should be, rather than right now it's the whole thing is the same. You know, you're coming out as a first-year coach, and there's an expectation that you need to understand not only all of the things that come along with coaching, but also all of the things that come along with sports science, and how to integrate it all into this very complex system without having any experience or any expertise. And that's impossible. So yeah, I agree 100% with what you said. And I think, you know, I think that the important take home here is the more things that you put into your system, the more complex you make it, the harder it is for you to understand, the harder it is for you to control, and the harder it is for you to predict. So if you've got this big, messy, complex system, you will be lost. It doesn't matter how much experience you've got. Try to simplify your system as much as you possibly can, so you can better control it, better understand it, and better predict it. And once you've proven that you can do those 3 things with this system, then you can make it a bit more complex. You can add another piece to the system, because it's always about understanding how all of these component parts within the system interact and interrelate together to serve the function or the purpose of the system. And right now we can't do that, and we've got however many pieces in there.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you so much. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they find the Altis Foundation course, or all those online courses for like track coaches?
Yeah, you go to altis.world, so altis.world. That's our website. Everything is on there. All of our courses. So we've got the Performance Trinity, which is a foundation course, the Need for Speed course, and the Performance Therapy course. And we've got all of our track and field courses as well. We've got some little pocket guides, some smaller courses, and obviously we're quite quite busy on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at Altis, ALTIS.
Thank you.